All right, we're ready for Job chapters 31 to 34 in our study of the book of Job. And we are in this Job's final declaration as we have been talking about the cycles of speeches. The cycles are over, meaning Job's friends have ceased their speech. There's one more friend that's going to speak up, Elihu, that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but not just yet. We're still in Job's final declaration. This is where we are, and then we'll start into Elihu's speech. We haven't heard from him. Apparently he's been there all along. He's heard at least what the Job has been saying. He seems to have heard the friends and what they've had to say, and we'll say more about that in a moment. Let's talk about Job's final declaration. Job, as you remember, started out in chapter 1 lamenting the day of his the day of his birth, wished he had died at birth, wished he could die now. That started the cycle of speeches, and so it was Eliphaz, then Job, Bildad, then Job, Zophar, then Job, Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, Zophar, then Job, and then Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, and then it's Zophar's turn. He doesn't speak. Job continues to speak. And then when Zophar doesn't say anything, then Job starts into this final declaration after this interlude on wisdom in chapter 28. So we covered chapters 29 and 30. In this, he talked about his former happiness, then his present humility, and today we're going to talk about his challenge of innocence. You remember in his former happiness, he talked about how things used to be, how he was highly respected, he was well blessed. Things were just like sitting in a tub of butter for him. And yet in chapter 30, he talks about his present humility. He's mocked. He's in agony of disease. He cries out to God. God crushes him. I've done good and I receive evil. And then now he's ready to talk about something else. So let's go to question number 1. Question 1, what does Job say about himself in chapter 31? All right, starts listing all the sins and things that he has not done. I have not done this, I've not done that, I've not done the other, etc. What else? Anything else on that? All right, yes. Not only has he not committed them, but he abhors those sins and calls for some form of punishment to be done to him if he were to be guilty of those. You remember that the friends start out in the cycle of speeches making the general charge. Job, you've done wrong. You've sinned. What have I done? Well, you've done wrong. Later they begin to make some specifics, and what charges specifically have they made? All right, perhaps he's stolen, or maybe he's got his money by ill-gotten gain, or he has ill-gotten gain because of his wealth. But that's all based on an assumption. What else have they said about him?
They said you had to have sinned, and blatantly, just anything.
Yeah.
This unfounded criticism of you sinned somehow because God has punished you.
Yeah, they charge him in a general way. They charge him with maybe you've done something because of your wealth, and then they charge him with hypocrisy. It's about the only other thing they've charged him with. Job I said all that to say, Job in his denial has been denying in a general way, I haven't done wrong. I haven't done what you're saying. I haven't committed sin. If so, tell me what I did. So Job turns in chapter 31, and this is his declaration of innocence, or challenge of innocence, some have called it. And he starts listing sins and says, I haven't done. Since they have not been real specific, he will be specific. And I haven't done this, I haven't done that, I haven't done this other. And we'll get to those specifics in a moment. A couple of things I want to observe about chapter 31. Some have called chapter 31 this being God's virtuous man, and parallel in principle to Proverbs 31, which was God's virtuous woman. So if you want to see a picture of a godly, virtuous woman, go to Proverbs 31. You want to see a picture of a godly, virtuous man? Look at Job 31. It is a picture of a godly, virtuous man who doesn't do the things that are mentioned here, and he does the things that are enumerated, such as he shows hospitality, he is honest, he takes care of his servants, etc. The second thing I want to mention is the fact that he deals with what's called a negative form of denial. Instead of saying, I have not committed adultery, he words it like this, saying, if I have done X, Y, Z, then let this happen to me. Does that make sense? And that's just a negative form of denial. What he's saying is, I haven't committed adultery. But he words it in this negative form, saying, if I have done X, Y, Z, then let this happen to me. And may this happen to me. And it's a way of saying, I have not committed. He makes an appeal to God in all of this. So let's work through this. This is a bright side of the book of Job. Let's start with verses 1 to 4. What does he say he has not done? I have not lusted. He said, I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? In other words, I haven't been one that has looked and lusted after the young woman. But notice what he said he did in order to stop that and prevent that sin. What did he say? Verse 1. What does that mean? He made a covenant with his eyes. Yeah, yes.
I guess made a predetermined condition with himself or agreement that he's not going to do that.
Yeah, he was predetermined. In other words, he didn't wait to the moment of temptation. I think that's the idea. A predetermined dedication and determination. That he didn't wait to the moment of temptation, and as he's looking, and before it leads to lust, that he begins to think, you know what, I shouldn't be doing this. But long before he ever is presented with the temptation, I made a covenant with my eyes. In other words, I made an agreement. That's what a covenant is. I made an agreement with my eyes that if I saw that, I wouldn't look. And so I made a covenant with my eyes. Why should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment from God above? An inheritance from the Almighty on high. What's the connection here with God about this? What's he saying? Absolutely. It's an interesting phrase. Twice in Job chapter 1, he shunned evil. Didn't mean he never committed sin, but as soon as he saw that there was sin, he turned from it and he tried to avoid it in any way. Verse 2, this idea of that for what allotment is God. In other words, I would give an account to God for that. That's what he's saying. I'm most interested now at verse 3 and 4. Is that not destruction for the wicked and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and count all my steps? What's verse 4 saying? Say again? Yeah, God sees the hidden sin. This matter of lust is a hidden sin. This is not something that, unless someone is making quite blatant about that, they could look and lust and not be seen by everybody as looking and lusting. Not like stealing, where everybody's seeing him steal. Or everyone knows they're committing adultery. They're looking and lusting and no one knows what's going on in the mind. So here is a hidden sin, or the sin of hypocrisy that they have accused him of. And his point is, God sees my ways and counts all my steps. God knows every step I take and sees everything I do. So why would I look at a woman and lust? Because I would have to give an account unto God. Because God sees everything I say and everything I do and every step I take. All right, let's go to this. Yes?
The friends could accuse God of a lot of things, but if he's lusting, that's not something you can prove. That is only something God can know with a whole. And so he's confessing not just to those things and saying, here's things that you can't prove, that you could prove against me, but he's going even deeper and saying, there's things about me that you couldn't even prove, but I didn't do that.
I didn't do that either. Good point. Verses 5 to 8. What does he say he didn't do? All right. He's not been dishonest. I have not walked with falsehood nor hastened to deceit. And notice here's that negative form. If I have walked in falsehood, then here's what needs to be done or should be done. Let me be weighed in a just balance. and that God may know my integrity. So let it be weighed out. If I've lied, let it be shown. Let the evidence show it, and let God weigh me out in my integrity. Look at verse 8. Here's another, that consequence. Then let me sow and another eat, and let my harvest be rooted out. What does that mean? If I've been dishonest, if I've been deceitful, then may my possessions be taken away. May my crop that I sow, let somebody else eat of it. In other words, may I suffer consequence because of my sin. If that's the case. In other words, I have not lied. I have not been dishonest. Third thing. Now this one's quite interesting because we learn a great deal here. Beginning at verse 9, he's saying, I have not committed adultery. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I've lurked at my neighbor's door, if I've been seeking after my neighbor's wife, then this is quite strange to us. But he said, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. Perhaps, let's go over to 2 Samuel, chapter 11. This may help us a little bit. This is the case of David, and look at verse 11. This is in the context of David and his sin with Bathsheba. Verse 11, thus says the Lord, behold, I'll raise adversity against you from your house, and I will take your wives from before your eyes and give them to another, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of in the sight of this son. Now that's quite interesting. That because of the sin, God said, I'm going to let your wife be given to another, and someone else will lay with her. In other words, talking about the intimate relationship. And several take this, and they are correct at verse 10, that if I have committed adultery with another woman, then let my wife bow down before another, or others bow down over her, meaning may she have relationships with another, may she be given to another man. In other words, that's a serious consequence. That's like a man raising his hand and said, I haven't committed adultery, and if you can prove it, then take my wife away from me. That's pretty stout testimony that indeed he has not committed adultery. Now, at verse 11, what does he call adultery? We learned some things about adultery here. It's a heinous crime. King James uses the word, and you might make a marginal note if you're not using the King James. The New King James that I'm using says, for that would be wickedness, and that's true, and it would be iniquity, worthy of judgment. But the King James words it as a heinous crime. God views it as a heinous crime. And so did Job. But he says more at verse 12. Not only is it a sin against God, it's wickedness. He said, if I did that, that would be great wickedness against God. But he says something else. Besides it just being wrong, what does that mean? Yeah, reminds us of Proverbs 6. Wounds and dishonor will he get. Verse 33. Yeah, for that would be fire that consumes to destruction and would root out all my increase. In other words, there's great consequences that come with that. There's destruction. There's moral destruction. It destroys the family, destroys the self-esteem, the self-respect. Again, wounds and dishonor will he get. Proverbs chapter 6. All right, let's go further. I have not oppressed my servants, verses 13 to 15. If I've despised the cause of my manservant or maidservant, when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God arises? Now look at verse 15. What do you get from verse 15? In other words, what he's just said is, in 13 and 14, when I had servants, I never oppressed a servant. And I didn't treat this servant better than I treated that servant. Verse 15 says, why? Why is that? They're all equal. Yeah, look at verse 15. Did not he who made me in the womb make them? In other words, he may have had the servant, he may have been the master, he had slaves, and yet he's saying that God who made me made them too. And the same one fashioned us in the womb. So we're all equal. That's why I treated them fairly. And so I never mistreated them. All right, what does he say in verse 16 now through verse 23? I never refused to help those that were in need. If I've kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eye of the widow to fail, or eaten morsel by myself, said the fatherless didn't eat. In other words, if I kept food from those that needed food while I was taking care of myself, then he's to suffer consequence for that. What else do you see in 16 to 23? Look at verse 21. If I've raised my hand against the fatherless when I saw the help in the gate, then let my arm fall from the shoulder and let my arm be torn from the socket. In other words, if I've done, may this be a serious consequence that comes upon me. For the destruction is from God is a terror to me. In other words, I don't want to face the terror of the Lord for not helping those who are poor. All right, what's the next thing he mentions? 24 to 28. I didn't engage in idolatry. But notice how he words this, though. If I have made gold my hope. He's not really talking so much about bowing down before gold and saying gold is my God. But if I've made gold my hope and said to find gold, you are my confidence. Could that be done in our present day by some of us?
By seeking money or riches, you'd be doing the same thing.
All right, by seeking money. That's good. How could I have, let's use the wording here. How could gold be my hope? Let's take gold and put the word money there, because most of us don't have literal gold, but we have that which represents gold, and that's money. All right, preference material things. How can we trust in riches? That's what I'm fishing for. You're right. I've got money, I'm okay. So I can buy anything, I can do anything. I'm secure, I feel safe because I've got money. Does that make us safe? Obviously not. But he said, but Job had a lot of money. But he said, that wasn't my hope, that wasn't my confidence. If I hadn't rejoiced because my wealth was great and because my hand had gained much, or if I had observed the sun or the moon, that's worship of the stars. Then verse 27 is interesting. This is the literal meaning of worship. So that my heart had been secretly enticed and my mouth kissed my hand. To kiss the hand toward is literally what worship means, to kiss the hand toward. Then that would be iniquity worthy of judgment, and I would have denied God who is above. Now notice, if I put confidence in riches, I've denied God, or if I worship the sun and the moon, I would have denied God. Either one is a denial of God, both are idolatry. I didn't commit that. 29 and 30, 2 verses, what does he say? Yeah, well, if my enemy had faltered and I rejoiced at that, then I would be worthy of judgment. And he said, I haven't done that. Look at verse 31 and 32. I haven't refused hospitality if men of my tent have not said, who is there who has not been satisfied by his meat? So no sojourner had to lodge in the street. I never refused hospitality to anyone. Look at verse 33 and 34. Now this was the charge the friends had made, that he ignored his sins. And he said, if I've covered my transgression as Adam. Now that may have reference to Adam, as in the first man. The word for Adam can also mean man. And he may be talking about mankind in general. I'll let you decide what you think about that. But if I've covered my transgression as mankind does, or as Adam did, tried to hide his, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I feared the great multitude or dreaded the contempt of the families, so that I kept silence and did not go out the door. In other words, I didn't ignore my sin. I didn't try to keep it secret and hide it. And I haven't done that. I'm not a hypocrite like you claimed that I was. All right, now this is kind of a veering from that list. And what does he say now in 35 to 37? What I really wished would happen. I wish God would vindicate me. Yeah, this seems to be a high point in this part of his speech. Here he says, "Oh, that I had one to hear me, and here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, and my prosecutor had written in a book." I wish, and notice how he says that he would bind it on like a crown, and he'd approach God like a prince. I wished I had vindication and had it written down, and it was sealed and stamped so that I have the proof in my hand that I am innocent, and I would approach God like a prince. I would wear this like a crown over my head, that I have the vindication with me. Here is the vindication. God has signed off. Here is his signature that says, I am innocent. But he's crying out for that. Now, the last thing that he mentions here is very similar to something he's already said. And what is it? 38 to 40. Yeah, I haven't been dishonest at all. And if I have, this is interesting. If I've eaten the fruit without money, verse 39, then let thistles grow instead of wheat. The New American Standard says, let stinkweed grow instead of wheat and weeds instead of barley. Again, that form of negative denial, that if that's the case, then may my crops then turn to stinkweed and be worthless. May that be the case. So this is Job's final declaration of innocence. My former happiness, my present humility, and here's the innocence. I have not done any of these things. And God knows I haven't done any of these things. All right, let's shift gears now, and we're ready to talk about Elihu. So let's go to question number 2. What do we know, if anything, about Elihu? All right. Verse 6 tells us he's younger. And because of that, he's been showing some respect for those that are older. There's a practical lesson to learn there. And he waited in preference to those who are older, who should be wiser, to let them speak first. And when they finally gave out, then he's going to rise up and speak. What else do we know? Other than who his dad was, Baruch. He's from Ram. What else do we know? Anything? Say again. All right. He is. Appears to have been there all the time. In the first chapter, our first 3 chapters, or at the end of chapter 3, I'll get there in a minute. At the end of chapter 3, it talks about Job's friends coming, and when they heard about all of his problems, but he's not mentioned there. But what makes us think he's probably been there all along, or at least for most of this discussion?
Because he burned anger at the 3 friends because they didn't get the answer that he felt like was needed from Job.
Okay. Yeah, he knows what's been said. He knows what the friends have been saying. He knows what Job's been saying. So he has access to this information of the speeches, though he hasn't said anything. So we assume he's been there all along. Now to stop and footnote. We've already seen a reference earlier that this has gone on for months. So how long did all this discussion go on? I don't know. Somebody asked me that. I was in Knoxville on Sunday night, and somebody asked me, and we were studying Job, he said, tell me, how long do you think this went on? I said, I don't know. I know it went on for months, for many months. But how long did this go on? I don't know. But if you read the speeches, you would think it took place within just 2 or 3 days, or maybe even a day, where Job speaks, and then Eliphaz speaks, and then Bildad, and then Zophar, and then Job, and then they go through the cycle, and you could do all of that in just a couple of hours, and it's over. No, this went on for months. So Elihu rather, has been there apparently through most of this, if not all of it, and has been silent. There's something to be said about that. So let's go to question number 3. Elihu's speech is found in 32 to 37, summarize the first 3 sections of his speech. That is in 32, 33, and 34. Basically, what does he do in 32, I'm sorry.
He talked about how he's been patient this whole time because he was allowing them to speak because of their wisdom, but he's angry and frustrated with them because he sees that maybe there's perhaps a lack of wisdom when it comes to the great older men, and also talks about how they couldn't condemn Job or they couldn't prove their condemnation of Job.
All right. That's a good point. Anything else? Question number 3.
He claims to speak for God.
Yeah, he does.
Chapter 33, verse 4.
Yeah. That. In other words, this is. I take it, to put it in our language, that this is the final word on this. This is the final word. I've listened to all y'all. This is the final word. Was this the final word? No, God hadn't spoke yet. God's going to have the final word on this. Yes, ma'am.
Before he gets to that point, though, in verse 10, he said,
Sometimes we impress ourselves and we think it's really good. This seems to be what Elihu is saying. Now, we're going to look at some introductory thoughts here in verses 1 to 5. We'll get to that in a second. But chapter 32, he seems to focus on Job's friends. And the bottom line is, you haven't proved your point. You fellows haven't done what you said. You said Job had sinned and you were going to prove it, and you hadn't done it. Chapter 33, he rebukes Job. You've complained against God, and that isn't right. And then in chapter 34, he defends the justice of God. Does that make sense? All right, let's make our way through that now. So let's see what happens here in verses 1 to 5. Verse 1 in verse 32 says that Job's friends had ceased to answer Job. Verse 2 tells us his anger with Job because he justified himself and not God. Rather than defending God, Job defends himself. And so look at verse 2, that his wrath was aroused because he justified himself rather than God. Verse 3 said he was angry with the friends because there was no answer and they condemned Job. In other words, they didn't give any proof. So I'm upset with you because of what you said about yourself versus defending God, and I'm upset with you, friends, because you did not give Job his evidence. But the text says, now this is not Elihu speaking yet. This is the author telling us what's going on at verses 4 and 5, that he waited because they were years older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three, his wrath was aroused, and so he began to speak. So let's see what he said. In chapter 32 now, this is what happens. That he speaks here. Now there's only 22 verses here, so we don't have much we have to work through. But it's a rebuke of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, is what he's doing here. So let's see what he says in chapter 32. He says, first of all, at verse 6, I was younger and I was old, and you were very old. Therefore I was afraid and dared to declare my opinion. But what does he say at verse 7? Now this one is quite interesting. Verse 7 and 9. Say again. I was expecting some wisdom from you. I kept my silence because you were much older than me. You were years older than me. And I thought a multitude of years should teach wisdom. Great men, though, look at verse 9, are not always wise, nor are the aged always do they understand justice. That's powerful. Is that true today? It ought to be that someone who is years older than you ought to have more wisdom than you. But I want to tell you, I've seen a lot of people who had a lot of gray hair who had no wisdom at all, and I've seen some people that were very young who had a lot of wisdom. Have you seen that? Yeah. So age and wisdom don't always go hand in hand. It ought to be, and that's what Elihu is saying, it ought to be because you're older, you have more wisdom. But I haven't been impressed with your wisdom. I waited for your wisdom and I didn't see it. Now beginning at verse 10, what does he say in 10 to 14? Yeah. You're accusing Job, and I kept waiting for the evidence. I kept waiting for the evidence. Key to that section is verse 12. I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job or answered his words. What does that mean? Yeah. It's one thing to say you've done wrong. It's another thing to say you did wrong because I have the evidence and here it is. You didn't do that. That's a pretty stout accusation against these three friends, isn't it? That you made charges without proof is what you did. And I'm angry with you at that. I waited for your wisdom and I haven't seen wisdom. And so in verse 15 to 22, what's he say? Yeah. You finally ran out of stuff to say. I waited, look at verse 16, because you did not speak, because you stood still and answered no more, I will also answer my part. And how does he describe it in verse 19? I've been sitting over here listening. Yeah, wine that's in the bottle is about ready to burst because of no vent, and it's ready to burst out of the vent, and consequently, he said, I'm about to burst. I've got to say something. I've been waiting, and deference to your age, and he said, I haven't heard what I should have heard. So that gets us through verse 22, and I know we didn't look at every verse and every word, but the summary of his speech is, age doesn't always mean wisdom. It should have. I waited for your words. You didn't convince Job. Y'all quit speaking, and I've been about to die to speak, and I've got to have something. I'm going to say something to you now, and here it is. Make sense? All right. Let's go to chapter 33 now. And let's get question number 4 here. Question number 4 on chapter 33, though it's later in the chapter. What did Elihu say about God's, how God works or deals with man? All right, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in visions. What else? All right, sometimes in pain and sometimes in sickness. What else are you seeing in chapter 32? About what he said. Or chapter 33, I'm sorry. Say again, George.
He also said that God sent men to call man to turn to him. The word repent comes to him.
All right. Yeah, he makes a chart, and we'll say more about this in a second, but he makes this point that sometimes God speaks in visions and dreams, and sometimes God chastens men. And so, and he, like the Friends, is right in general principle, but he's not right in every application that he makes. Let's work our way through and we'll see what we're talking about. So in verses 1 to 7, this is basically his rebuke of Job in chapter 33 now. And he said, listen to me and answer my words. So please listen to me. And as Tom mentioned a moment ago, notice at verse 4, he says, the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty has given me life. And it does seem like he's coming across saying, not only did God create me, but I want to tell you, I've got the final word on this, and that's not the case at all. But notice at verse 4, if you can answer me, set your words in order before me and take your stand. And verse 7 basically saying, you don't have any reason to fear me at all. So listen to me and answer my words. I've got something to say to you. Now 8 to 13, what does he say about Job's claim of innocence and his complaint against God? Well, let's see, verse 8. Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I've heard the sound of your words saying, I am pure without transgression. Now, that could mean one of two things. He could just be quoting Job, where Job's saying, I haven't committed sin that you claim. But it almost sounds like he's misrepresenting Job, because Job had never said he never sinned, did he? He is saying, I haven't committed sin so as to create this problem. This is not punishment for sin. I haven't rebelled against God. I haven't turned against God. And it seems at verse 9, as some authors have suggested, that this is not a true assessment of what Job is saying. Job would acknowledge that I have sinned from time to time. We all do. The idea of shunning evil, as mentioned earlier, and Lou mentioned that in chapter 1, means that he turned from any evil that he committed. But be that as it may, he's saying that here's this complaint that I have about you. You claim this innocence, and yet yet God finds occasion against me and counts me as the enemy. In other words, you complain against God, Job. You say you're innocent, and then you turn around and you complain against God. So look at 12 and 13. Here's the response. What does he say? In this, you're not righteous. I will answer you. For God is greater than you. Why do you contend with him? For he does not give an accounting of any of his words. In other words, God doesn't give an account to you at all. So is he right in his rebuke of Job? In principle. That's a good way to word that. Is he right if he's saying Job is claiming innocence? He's right. If he's saying Job has made the claim, I have never committed sin, he's wrong. If he's saying Job is not right in complaining against God, he's right about that because God rebukes him later about that. But that's his answer to Job is, Job, you've made this claim of innocence and you complain against God. Now then he turns in verses 14 to 30 to talk about how God deals with man. Let's see what he says. He basically says two things. First of all, in verse 15, sometimes God deals with man in dreams and in visions. But then beginning at verse 19 through 30, we're at point C2 here on the slide, that sometimes God chastens through suffering. And it almost sounds like, finish my sentence, that Elihu is saying much the same thing as his three friends. But he's not really. Let's get to that. He goes a little bit different from that. He said, man is also chastened in pain in his bed. In other words, the three friends were saying that Job had committed sin and suffering as a consequence. What Elihu seems to be saying is that your suffering, God is allowing you to suffer to keep you from committing sin. Now, is that a true principle? Well, God could work that way, but finish my sentence. Elihu has no way of knowing if that's true. Would you agree with that? All right. So that he abhors bread, etc. Now, I want to get down to verse 23 here in just a second. God chastens through suffering. But then he says at verse 23, if there is a messenger for him or mediator among them to show man his uprightness, then he is gracious toward him and he says, deliver me from going down into the pit. Let's look back at that messenger there. I don't know who he's talking about. Some think he's talking about the Messiah. I don't think so. That doesn't seem to fit here. Some think he's talking about some prophet. Others think, and this makes good sense, that Elihu was thinking of himself as the messenger. In other words, what he's saying is, this is how God deals with man. God sometimes deals with man through dreams and vision. Sometimes God deals with man through chastening and allows him to suffer, and man doesn't understand it, and then a messenger is sent that explains it to him. By the way, I'm that messenger. Does that make sense? Yeah. They had no wisdom, but he utters pure knowledge. And it seems to me, now you can reject that, and I'm not going to argue with you over it, but it almost to me seems like that messenger, God sends a messenger to explain all of what's going on with man, and oh, by the way, that's me. That seems to be what he's saying to me. Now, that's to bring him back from the pit. Verse 30, by the way, is I think part of the key to that, to bring his soul from the pit. In other words, God causes suffering to prevent that kind of problem. Now, Haley makes the observation here, for what it's worth to you, and I want to get this if we can, and then get 34, that Elihu speaks in general. What Elihu has described, says, although he speaks in general, what Elihu it does is describe Job's condition. Job had complained that his leanness testified against him. But if we consider what Elihu said, and do not put words in his mouth and what he does not say, we see that what he is not saying, that he is not saying that God is punishing Job for committing sin. I kind of stumbled through reading that because I was trying to read two lines at the same time. But what he said was, don't put words in Elihu's mouth. Elihu did not say Job had committed sin. He is not saying the same thing his friends had said. He's just simply saying, you may be suffering as a way that God would prevent you from committing sin. But he hadn't have any way of knowing that. So Elihu hasn't done a whole lot better than Job's friends has he? In explaining what's going on. None of them are giving the explanation we saw in chapters 1 and 2 and 3 of the book of Job. All right, let's go now to chapter 34. Time is running out, so let's go there. This is his defense of God's justice. And there's a lot here, but I think we can summarize it rather quickly. Verses 1 to 9, he said, Job is a companion of the wicked since he accuses God of injustice. You accuse God of injustice. Look at verse 5. For Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my justice. And so, Job, what you're doing is accusing God of injustice. Look at verse 7. What man is like Job, who drinks scorn like water and goes in company with the worker of iniquity? You're in the same class of workers of iniquity, Job. You're no better than the world if you are complaining against God. So in 10 to 30, what does he basically do?
He said, God doing wickedness like man does.
All right. This is a defense of the justice of God. Job has acknowledged the justice of God. So has Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Now let's go back to something we said at the beginning of our study. Most of these friends, or all of these friends in fact, not most, but all of these friends, including Elihu, much of what they say is good Bible doctrine. You reap what you sow. They just misapply that. So is what he's saying about the justice of God true? He says God renders to man what he sows. God is not subject to anyone. God rules and governs and demands justice. God punishes the wicked. Is all that true? Sure it is. What he's doing is defending the justice of God. Job, you have attacked the justice of God. God is a just God. God does what's right. But Job had acknowledged that in chapter 19, if you remember. So let's finish this chapter here. Verses 31 to 37. What does he say in that section? 31 to 37. He's right, by the way, before we leave that section 29 and 30, that God's silence and inactivity doesn't mean that evil escapes. God is silent. That doesn't mean because God's not speaking and God's not acting, that doesn't mean that punishment is going to escape or the sinner is going to escape. That's not going to happen at all. So now 31 to 37, to finish this quickly, this is a response to God's chastening. Chastening ought to make man repent and turn to God. It almost sounds like he's hinting at the same kind of thing the friends do. I'm not sure that he is, but he seems to be saying that. Look at verse 31. For has anyone said to God, I've borne chastening and I will offend no more? That's a rhetorical, yeah, man have done that. Look at verse 33. Should he repay it according to your terms? That may mean you decide. God will do what he wants, or whether you accept it or you don't accept it. Verse 33 may be saying that point. Verse 34, men of understanding say to me, wise men who listen to me, Job speaks without knowledge. Wise men would say Job is speaking without knowledge. So wise men agree Job is speaking without wisdom, and Job rebels against God, and Job is thrashing out at God. And so he gives Job a pretty good tongue lashing here about attacking the justice of God. And he defends the justice of God. And it's, again, and is he right in what he says? I think he is right about that Job was unjust in attacking the justice of God. But he's speaking as if he's speaking the final word on that, and he's not the final word. Does that make sense? So, what's your conclusion about Elihu? You've listened to all the speeches. And other than, let's take Job out of the picture, who did the better job of making any of the speeches of all these people? Probably him. He's done better. In other words, if I'm sitting here and I'm going to take sides with anybody, I'm probably going to say I'm not agreeing with any of you fully. But if I had to join somebody's camp, I think I'd join the camp of Elihu. He did a better job of setting the record closest to being straight as anybody, except for Job declaring his innocence. Now, I'm taking Job out of the picture. I'm talking about his friends now. I can't agree with Eliphaz, and I can't agree with Bildad, and I can't agree with Zophar. And I don't agree with everything that Elihu said, but he came closer to explaining it than anybody. He didn't fully explain it, though, did he? But he came closer. He did a better job.
One thing we always forget, they don't ever take Satan into account.
Exactly.
And I think we do that in our own life. We don't realize how powerful Satan really is.
Yes. They only talk about God here. God did this to me. God caused this. God's targeting me. Nothing is said about Satan targeting. That's a good point.
Bad things are happening. There's so many people now. Well, why is God doing this? God allowed it. God is not causing it.
You're exactly right about that. Practical lessons. Let's get one or two in, and then we'll wind this up. What have you learned from chapters 31 to 34?
In 34, in my opinion, it seems to make a point that about Job, and the good which should come. But the friends, it goes back to the first part of the speech where it says that the friends, you accused him without evidence. Then it's when you say to them, you didn't do this.
Yeah.
He said, this is what you did. He said, okay, I will forget about you. I will focus on Job.
He turned his focus more toward Job.
We need to be able to see more sides of the story of what we do.
Good point. We'll pick up with chapter 35 next time.